Hello, my name is Dr. Kortney Hernandez, and on behalf of the LITE Center, I would like to welcome you to this short presentation on teaching as an act of love, loving students unconditionally. This presentation will center what it means to love students deeply, not just in the sentimental sense, but rather in a pedagogical sense that values the individual and collective humanity of students. In this presentation, I borrow the phrase teaching as an act of love from the powerful and liberating contributions of critical educational philosophers Paulo Freire and Antonio Rade. It is their contributions to my personal intellectual formation that brings this work to life. Many educational philosophers have theorized the importance of care, compassion, and love in ways that are instructive for our continued capacity to build a connection with students. This is particularly necessary given the feeling of disconnection that many students experience when thrust into our current online formats. Sometimes loving our students can often be rendered suspect in institutional spaces that may place value on other priorities. Yet, it is critically important that if the goal is to foster and support the intellectual formation and development of critical thinking for students, then we must, as educators, truly care and love students. You cannot inspire students if you do not love them or know them. To begin, Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educational philosopher, once said, quote, "The final virtue, if possible, is the ability to love students in spite of everything. I don't mean a kind of soft or sweet love, but on the contrary, a very affirmative love, a love which accepts, a love for students which pushes us to go beyond, which makes us more and more responsible for our task," end quote. And that task, as Paulo Freire stated, is what he referred to as our true vocation in life, which is to strive to become more fully human, to honor the humanity of our students. Thus, love becomes essential for humanizing and liberatory practices. Paulo Freire theorized deeply about what it meant to have the courage to embrace love as an educator, which meant trying 1,000 times before giving up. Consequently, what this required for educators was the capacity to love and to see students as human beings and not objects, the latter leading to dehumanizing conditions and practices in the classroom. Paulo Freire is well known for his seminal text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, written in 1970, which has and continues to have a profound impact on educators. Another critical text is Teachers as Cultural Workers, Letters to Those Who Dare Teach, where in discussing love, he states, "It is indeed necessary, however, that this love be an armed love, the fighting love of those convinced of the right and the duty to fight, to denounce and to announce. It is this form of love that is indispensable to the progressive educator and that we all must learn." One critical question we must ask ourselves as educators is, are students being banked? One of the most dehumanizing practices that educators can actually enact in the classroom results in the form of what Paulo Freire termed banking education. In the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. In order to assess whether our students are being subjected to forms of banking education, we must consider if students are becoming passive learners instead of active learners. This question is critical because if we only see students as mere receptacles to deposit our expert knowledge into, then we lose the opportunity to learn the knowledge that students hold. We disrespect their brilliance, and as educators, it is important to make space for students to think and rethink the knowledge they possess. Moreover, we have to examine the significance of our relationships with students. As Antonio Darder suggests, quote, many educators are so disconnected from the conditions of their students, especially students of color, and frightened by the racialized or class misconceptions they possess to allow themselves to genuinely know their students as vital human beings. Instead, students remain objects to be managed, manipulated, and controlled in ways that may eventually draw out of the student prescribed answers. And for Paulo Freire, that was part of the problem. End quote. Instead of prescribed answers, it is necessary to search for the organic knowledge that students produce and create knowledge together as a classroom. Additionally, quote, the way we treat our students has a lot to do with how we communicate to them the value of their life. This has much to do with the way we think about who they are. End quote. A good question to ask yourself as an educator is how often do you shut down students when they speak, question, or challenge you? It is clear that there is no model, cookie cutter approach, lists of standards, or recipe for loving students. As educators, we must see all students as coming into the class possessing brilliance and recognize this in a way that communicates to students that they are respected and valued. In seeking to create the conditions for humanizing learning experiences, we must consider our personal growth and learning as well. As Paulo Freire states, quote, whoever teaches learns in the act of teaching, and whoever learns teaches in the act of learning, end quote. We should always be in this symbiotic relationship of teaching and learning with students. Thus, this presentation will shift into sharing some pedagogical principles for loving students that have been critical to my work with students. According to Bell Hooks, quote, when teachers teach with love, combining care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust, we are often able to enter the classroom and go straight to the heart of the matter, which is knowing what to do on any given day to create the best climate for learning. End quote. These are indispensable qualities to educators who are willing to teach with love as their pedagogical weapon while simultaneously honoring the humanity of students. Thus, we must create the conditions for love in the classroom. Ask yourself, is my classroom a loveless classroom? Does it lack the loving experiences needed for students to succeed? I will begin to share 6 critical principles for further discussion that are listed here. They are authenticity, dialogue, understanding power, affirming students' voices, enacting a pedagogy of love, and revolutionary hope. Authenticity is a really critical principle. For one, students can tell when you are being authentic or inauthentic and fake. It is important to tell students the truth, especially in your interactions and through what curricular decisions you choose to make. Vulnerability is one of the key features that educators must possess in the classroom. It is often the case that the more vulnerable you are willing to be in the classroom, the more willing students are to be vulnerable with you. Authenticity is one of those qualities that educators must hone and must be willing to share with students in everything that you do and in every interaction that you have. The next critical principle is dialogue. Oftentimes, students are shut down in the classroom. It is important to know your students, talk to them, and learn who they are. Try not to choose and make decisions for them, but rather discuss and negotiate with them in a true form of dialogue. If a student is struggling in your class, consider, have you asked them why? Do you have a relationship with them? And do you even care if they pass? The voice of students matter, especially to the co-construction of knowledge in the classroom space. As educators, you need their voice to create a powerful and humanizing learning experience for everyone in the classroom. And this is not an easy task, as it requires an ongoing commitment to being in dialogue with the students, even if it is a difficult choice or even if it seems too time consuming. The next critical principle is understanding power. It is important to recognize that the teacher student dynamic is built upon asymmetrical relations of power, which basically means that the educator is often in a position of power and control over the student. These relationships of power often leave students in powerless positions. Thus, it is important to recognize the power you hold as an educator and always be mindful that every action you take for or against a student has an impact. More often than not, students are broken and shut down by the policies, practices, rules, and strictness of institutions. Let's really think and consider how we use our power and work toward using it in the best interest of the student. If you abuse your power or use it in a way that works against the student, oftentimes you can damage the relationship you have with that student. Thus, this is where dialogue and power go hand in hand. It is important to open up a dialogue with the student and for educators to be critically aware of how power is at work in the way decisions occur and actions are taken. The next critical principle is affirming students' voices, especially students of color who are often marginalized in educational spaces. Oftentimes, students may not be allowed to speak in a meaningful way. Thus, it is important for the educator to allow students the space to share their view of the world. This is especially the case for students of color, given the historical legacies of inequality. Affirming students' voices communicates that they are meaningful and powerful and that you respect what they have to say. Consider this question: in what ways are students rendered voiceless in your class? The next critical principle is enacting a pedagogy of love. This is not an overnight process. This is not something you can wake up and do tomorrow. What this requires is an ongoing commitment to the evolution of ourselves and our critical consciousness as educators. This requires that you love your students deeply and unconditionally, even when they challenge you, when they frustrate you, or even when they disappoint you. Oftentimes, when we have negative interactions with students, this triggers a reaction that does not reflect love. So we are challenged to dig deep and find that place of love so that our reactions towards students do not create unnecessary harm. We often have to use the tool of reflection to continuously and consciously evaluate interactions with students so that we can honor who they are. Enacting a pedagogy of love requires a deep commitment to ensuring that we continue to value the humanity of all students that enter into our classroom space. The last principle is revolutionary hope. This is a deep concept. It requires that you believe in your students and their capacity to achieve. Moreover, it is a radical hope and faith in students to grow, learn, and contribute to the world with all they possess. This represents, on the part of an educator, an undying commitment and belief in the student. This includes a belief in their life, belief in their hopes, belief in their dreams, belief in their studies, and belief in their ability to be who they are fully. Oftentimes, this requires educators to dig deep and share what things students are doing well as a way to contrast against always pointing out the negative aspects. Revolutionary hope is something that is bigger than what students can see in the classroom space. It means that educators are willing to not give up on a student. It is a deeper aspect of love that we are often unable to understand and see. Lastly, in order to know your students and love them, you must learn about them. This requires an ongoing evolution of your personal self and learning. Educators must continually grow and learn with their students, given that no one person knows everything. Thus, the co construction of knowledge is paramount to the success of the classroom. As Bettina Love stated in an article entitled, Dear White Teachers, You Can Love Your Black Students If You Don't Know Them, quote, for Black and Brown children in the United States, a major part of their schooling experience is associated with white female teachers who have no understanding of their culture. As a consequence, this results in the murdering of students' spirit with the lack of knowledge, care, and love of students' culture. End quote. Additionally, according to Bettina Love, the phrase often used is, quote, I love all students. The world the word all is meant to signal I am not a racist. I am fit to be in the classroom with students of color. The statement is used to show that white teachers can be kind to every Black and brown student that walks through their classroom doors. But how can you love or care for someone you know so little about? I do not think that white teachers enter the profession wanting to harm students of color, but they will hurt a student whose culture is viewed as an afterthought. End quote. In considering what it means to continually be reinventing yourself as an educator and continually be evolving as a human being, it is important that we recognize and continually reflect on where our shortcomings are. In closing, I'd like to leave you with some practical application in the form of questions to consider in your classroom. The first question is, are you a loving educator? And the questions beneath it are sub questions to this question. And they say, do you care if a student passes or fails your class? Do you know all of your students and something about each of them? Do you incorporate their culture and their interest in your teaching? Do you give up on students? Are you mean to students? And if so, why? Does the learning space you create recognize and value the humanity of students? If students are online, do they feel disconnected? Evaluate your classroom, especially online, and teaching practices for banking forms of education. It is so easy for us to get caught up in banking forms of education because we often teach the way we were taught. If we were subjected to banking forms of education, then it is easy for us to replicate that in the classroom. So then it requires a conscious shift in how we engage our students. Thus, you might ask these questions. Do you talk the most in your classes? When students speak, are they sharing a prescribed or expected answer? Are students co constructing the learning space? Do you care about what a student has to say? A few more questions that you might consider are: do you think students believe you are authentic? What does dialogue look like in your classroom? How many times do you shut students down when they are expressing themselves? Do you recognize the power you hold? Have students been hurt negatively? Have students been hurt or negatively impacted by decisions you have made? Do you believe love is important to enact in your pedagogical practices? Do you have hope for your students? How many students are failing your class? What have you done to support them? Have you given up on students? What will you do today to learn more about the different cultures that students bring into the classroom? How will you learn more about the unique challenges that students of color face in the world and in schools? I'd like to end here and to offer my thanks for listening to my presentation. I'd also like to offer a reading list for a few of the articles that were mentioned in this presentation. Feel free to scan the QR code for access to this list. Thank you so much for your time. I hope this presentation was helpful in thinking about how we might theorize and enact a deep love in the classroom. Thank you.